Hello, friends. Today we're going to finally get to talk about our dear friend Ram Dass. And I left off last time kind of taking you through the first half of my journey in the year that I took off after I had this awakening experience. And as I described earlier, it was unsought after, it was unexpected. I often have described it like flipping a light switch. And in that moment, all my preferences changed, all my joys and my hates and my things that would draw me to be motivated towards certain end goals or desires, all that had shifted, and some of it had erased, and some of it had just drastically changed in a really beautiful, wonderful way, in that all my energy and my time and my resources were redirected to directly, overtly positive things. And there were many things in my life that I didn't realize were not actually bringing me joy. Because the way it works socially is that often we are around groups of people who are all encouraging a similar type of behavior. And it's hard for us to experience exactly what we're authentically feeling in our own heart for ourselves. Like, is this truly joy? Am I here out of fear? Am I here out of anxiety? Am I here for any other reason than my heart really caused me to be in this place at this moment with this person? And so that was a new way of really getting to the core of truth for my life and how I spent all my time. So with that in mind, I took you through the first half of my journey, which led me through Encinitas and after that going to India and Africa. The story of Ram Dass is a funny one because ultimately, as I mentioned, I found my spiritual home with Neem Karoli Baba. Neem Karoli Baba was Ram Dass's guru and teacher. And as I've mentioned, when you start on this path, if you will, if you don't have any anchors, then it's beautiful because everything is possible, but it can also be overwhelming because, again, the sea of spirituality is incredibly, incredibly vast in the number of lineages and practices and people and podcasts and retreats and all the things. And ultimately, what I found in a variety of practices that I've had the blessing to so far experience, ultimately it comes back into the one. And ultimately, Neem Karoli Baba, who we'll talk about more, who is my master teacher, the center of my life, at this point to guide me and help me navigate this incarnation. Ultimately, he always talked about all these different lineages and practices. He talked about Jesus a ton. He talked about the Buddhist lineage, all the things, and he said it's all one. It all comes back into one. And so that's been my direct experience through a number of things that we'll talk about through a series of these podcasts, as well as respecting the teachings of those who've gone before us and experienced that oneness as well. So as you first start to go on these explorations, depending on who you're working with and what you're reading and who you're learning from, to get to that oneness, sometimes it's in fact a path, it's a journey. And so wherever you start is where you start, and that's perfect. But it can be overwhelming for sure, and it can feel confusing at first as you start to navigate and you're trying to get your North Star, which is aligned with your heart and your truth of your body, the wisdom in your own body. And you do that by experiencing a lot of different things, and you keep going within. And you get quiet and you use other practices to stay connected to that quote-unquote North Star that's guiding a general direction. And then you're kind of like a permeable membrane, if you will. If you think about like cells are a permeable membrane, meaning that things can wash across selectively to go in and out of cells. And ultimately, on a spiritual path, that is the most helpful way to be open to everything, but believing nothing, meaning that you're not afraid to question things and you're not afraid to experience new things. And at the same time, it doesn't mean that you take on things that are not for you, and it doesn't mean that you believe things that are not your direct experience. or not in line with your intuitive wisdom. So as I was starting this, I was having different experiences with communities and practices and things, but I hadn't found my home yet, my spiritual home that I would define as that place where you know that your heart has returned to, that for this particular incarnation at this time is the highest master teacher, the most deep unconditional love, the complete alignment that you know that this particular way of receiving teachings can be completely trusted. It feels safe to you. It's a deep intuition that you know that you've come home. And when you know that you come home on the spiritual path, that's not anyone else's home. That's a beautiful part about this, that you don't have to proselytize anyone. And in fact, if you're doing that, that will most likely become part of your journey as a learning for you to work with and reflect on, in terms of not being afraid of all the variety and the diversity of paths and teachings coming to the oneness, that it's all the same. Whether you go in through a plant-based medicine ceremony, or you go to the Himalayas and you learn yogically, or you learn through Jesus Christ, any of these things will ultimately, once you get beyond the believing and beyond the reading, once it's an embodied experience of wisdom, you will not need to believe anything. You will have a knowingness that is beyond the words and beyond the teachings. So that's really what that journey is about. So in the beginning, I was listening to all sorts of podcasts and reading a long, long list of books, just trying to absorb as much as I could, because I knew that I had had a spiritual awakening without a doubt, but it was still a very novel thing to me. I was still trying to figure out the dynamics of what this really was, and certainly looking for advice on how to experience this and work with the things that I was going through. And I had not talked to any of my friends about it because I didn't know how to articulate it. And I didn't have any friends that I was aware of who were overtly on a spiritual path. So I finally decided to confide in one of my dear friends who had actually lived with me for a short period of time. And surprisingly, he had also had a similar, different but similar experience that he was also generally not talking to people about. And so my openness to try to articulate it and put words around it opened our hearts to help each other. And at the end of that meetup, he said, there's this teacher named Ram Dass. Have you ever heard of him? And I said, I think I've heard the name, but I don't really know anything about him. He said, I think you would probably like him a lot. So why don't you consider listening to this podcast? So, at that point, again, there's 10 million things, and everyone wants to give you a podcast, and everyone wants to tell you 5 books to read. So I kind of put it on my list, and about a month went by, and I was doing yard work one day, and it's the Here and Now podcast, which I recommend people take a listen to if you're interested. And it's basically Ram Dass starting to talk about his own life story. And if you don't know of Ram Dass, in a nutshell, he was a professor at Harvard and Stanford and some other places in psychology, which was a very early field of study then. And they were studying academically LSD. LSD at that time was still a very novel phenomena, if you will. And they were, from an academic standpoint, trying to understand what this medium was, what this technology was, and how it could best be used. So he was running experiments, and he ultimately ended up giving some to students that he had promised not to. And that got him fired. And it sent him on his whole journey to basically take that, those learnings, that research that he had done around LSD, and take it to very high spiritual beings all around the world, to ask them honestly if they had a map. Could they give us any answers for what this was and how to use it and how to navigate it? And ultimately, after a much longer story, which is fascinating, he met a very revered Indian saint named Neem Karoli Baba. And Neem Karoli Baba was the first being that he had spent time with who truly knew everything about you. It wasn't like a trick where they would do like a psychic mind reading. It's like that being a true guru, not in the Western term for marketing purposes, like some know-it-all teacher that you're clinging to. This person generally doesn't teach in traditional teachings. This person is the channel through which you have experiences. And so they are you in some sense. They're not reading your mind. They are you. You are them. It's a little bit hard to conceive for some people, I'm sure. But anyway, he had that first experience with Neem Karoli Baba. And Neem Karoli Baba started telling him aspects of his life that were very secret. And that changed his whole life. That was just the beginning of opening him up. He ultimately went from being Richard Alpert, the professor, to Ram Dass. And Ram Dass wrote a book called Be Here Now, which was pivotal to the transition of spiritual practices and thinking in America in the 60s, 70s. Was a lot of that activity on into the 80s. And so I didn't know any of this. I had heard the name, but I knew none of the story. And if you listen to that very first episode, I'm not saying that he is high on the first episode, but just the voice sounds very kind of ethereal, I guess. So I'm listening to this ethereal voice. I'm like, okay, who is this? What's happening? And he's talking about his life. And again, I have no context. I haven't read anything about him. I'm just doing yard work listening to this. And if you listen to the first episode without any context at all whatsoever, and he's talking about LSD and the, Cultural Revolution, he's a professor. And I'm going, what does this have to do with meditation, breath work, spirituality? Like, I don't know what this is about. So I listened for maybe 30 minutes and I stopped. I said, okay, I don't know what this is. I'm going to move on to my other things that I've have prioritized in my list. And it was about a month later, I said, Brad really does know me well. I do trust that he knows me. I'm going to give this one more try. So I listened to the rest of the episode in episode 2, and he's going deeper into his story. I still don't know anything about him. I'm like, okay, I'm following the story. It's a little more interesting. Episode 3. Oh, okay, this is really interesting. Okay, now he's traveling around the world, meeting these spiritual beings. Okay, interesting. Episode 5 is when he eventually meets Neem Karoli Baba. And I'll let him tell the story if you decide to listen to the podcast. But he talks about that moment that his whole world shattered. And he had that opening when he's in the presence of one of these true saints. And I don't really think it matters what kind of experience you have. They're all different. They're all different varieties and flavors. But there are these moments where you walk through a threshold and you'll never, ever, ever be able to go back, even if you try very hard. And I would say my experience was that for me, and his experience was that for him. And so at that point, I'm like, whoa, oh my gosh, do these beings really exist? Is this real? All the things, the way he's describing Neem Karoli Baba and the things that he was seeing and witnessing. I'm like, is this really real? This seems like, I'm digging into his background a little bit more. I'm like, this guy seems legit. This is somebody who, people clearly respect. And so then I become kind of obsessed, with Neem Karoli Baba. I start reading all these stories about him and who is this being, and it wasn't just a curiosity, like, it wasn't a curiosity. There was something deeper that was like drawing me to it. And at this point, I'm transfixed. I'm reading all of his books and watching or listening to podcasts, and he has so much work, so many talks, an immense amount of talks and books, and it's a beautiful, beautiful collection of works. So I'm listening to all this stuff, but even in listening a lot, the first month or so, I'm still in his work from the 60s and 70s, very early work. And I assume, for whatever reason, with some kind of probably subconscious math in the back of my mind, I assume that he is no longer in his body. I assume that he's left his body and is in another realm somewhere. It doesn't ever dawn on me that he would still be here on Earth and you could potentially know him. So eventually, after some of these episodes, it would talk about, there is a website. I never gone to it because, again, I'm just deeply engrossed in the podcast and a couple of books. So eventually, over a month, when I've been completely transfixed by all this stuff and reading about Neem Karoli Baba a lot, I go to the website and it says, like he is still alive and he sees people every spring and every fall. And that, to me, like having been completely transfixed by somebody's work, assuming for whatever reason that he was not in his body and not on this earth anymore, I was like, what? Like, this guy he's still alive. Okay. Oh my gosh, this is amazing. And so at that point in time, he had had a stroke 30 years before, and he had been living in Maui for many, many years and had not left the island for the most part. And so he was seeing people in the spring and the fall, and there was just this thing that said, you can. So I was looking at it, and the next time was November. And it was one of those things where, it was a couple hundred people, and as soon as they would open up a registration, people would click, 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 and it was gone within like seconds, right? People would fight for these slots to go see him, especially people, who had met him before, maybe knew him earlier in life, versus, in addition, all the new people who are coming across his work. So I realized that for the November gathering, the deadline had been like in March or April or something, and it had been a couple months after that when I started really recognizing his work and was deep into it. So I missed that deadline. But there was a thing that said, every year there's just a few people, out of thousands that we pick from this list if you enter your email, sort of thing. And I was like, okay, you don't think about it, right? Yeah, sure, okay. And then I was off at that point. I was off to Encinitas in Africa and ultimately India. So those were my three things, and I was coming home after that. So I was in Africa. This was many months later, and I'm constantly listening to all of his stuff. I'm completely engrossed. And also little things started happening with Neem Karoli Baba early on. Just one example, because I can give you many, but as an example, I was really wishing that there was a place with people, that knew of Neem Karoli Baba that I could be with. And I said, it's unfortunate in Atlanta, we don't have anything like that. And I had generally known a lot of the places that were around Atlanta by that point. And I just said, I'm just going to go into Google and just type in ashram Atlanta, just very generic search, and just see what comes up. And there was this place that I didn't know of at the time called Kashi, Kashi. And I understand if you're a Ram Dass person, there's a whole longer story with Kashi. This time I didn't know any of the longer story. Save that for another podcast. But, I see this thing about Kashi. Now, there doesn't say anything about Neem Karoli Baba, like on the homepage or anything. And so I'm like, oh, okay, do like really, authentic yoga and some kirtan classes. Like, oh, this is really interesting. I didn't know existed. Going through the whole website, I'm trying to trace the lineage of this woman named Joya who had an ashram in Florida. And then this is like deep, deep, deep in the website on the About Us page. And then it's the founder, and the bottom of the founder page, it says she's a devotee of Neem Karoli Baba. Now, my heart's longing and desire on that particular day was I wish I had a place in Atlanta that I could be with other people who were with this being, who knew of this being. And in the same day, starting with a completely generic search, ashram Atlanta, the first thing that comes up, I go deep, deep, deep in all these pages, and there's like a one sentence mention of that. Like these things would start happening. So then I could go there, and I just started. These are how things started unfolding. So I go to Africa, and I definitely am not thinking about the website with Ram Dass or the potential to be with them in the fall. So I get this email one day, and it's from this guy named Mike Kroll, and it says, hey, congratulations, you're one of 3 people this year that we're inviting to come based on a couple cancellations, but you have to let us know within 24 hours. And I was like, wait, what? I'm very, very, very far out in Africa. I wasn't having normal reception. I finally got reception, emails came in, kind of thing. And so I'm flabbergasted. And also, I've been through so much that year, and now I've gone through all these journeys and experiences, and then this was the tail end of my last trip. It was India before this, all the stuff in the States before that, and this was like a full year basically. And then after that, I had promised myself I was going to go back to Atlanta and, start anew, whatever that looked like. And it felt important to do that. So now this was going to be another potential trip going from Africa pretty much straight to Hawaii. And I'd spent a lot of money like doing this. And so I just emailed Mike and I said, hey, I know you said 24 hours. I'm so grateful. Can you just give me 48 hours because I'm in the middle of Africa and I just need to take care of some things? And he said, yes, but that's it. So I go to bed that night and I have all these doubts, I have this deep desire, like, yes, this has to happen. This should happen. I can't imagine meeting this amazing teacher and being with him. And at the same time, all the things are coming up. Yes, but, you don't really have the money to do this properly per your plan. And you really made a promise to yourself that this was the last part of this journey of traveling to go back and reroute yourself. So I'm going through all of these different things, right? I was still working on closing my startup. So that's what I was still doing, and still just, money was coming in from that one client. So that very next morning, unbeknownst to me, there was a client that owed us a sum of money that had not been paid in like 18 months. And we had pursued them for it multiple ways, and they weren't going to pay it. That should have been paid, and they weren't going to pay their bill. So we'd written it off, and it was out of my mind. It was nowhere on the radar. We had not talked to them or had any communication in months and months and months and months and months and months. It's done, closed issue. The next morning after I got that email, that money had just, quote unquote, fallen into the account. And, it wasn't a huge sum of money, but it was more than enough to get over any qualms I had about being able to play with myself mentally around the game of money being the barrier. I was like, oh, that's very interesting set of events. And then, the only other thing I can come up with then is like the complexity of like getting the ticket, sorting the ticket out, yada, yada, yada. Not that that would have been impossible, but the mind is trying to create barriers. And then I remember when I had spent time with my brother, I mentioned he was coming out of a divorce, and he had been he is a morning radio show host. And so they give you things for sponsorships, and Alaska Airlines had given him round trip tickets anywhere in the country, but he had to use it before the end of that year. So when I was leaving him in June, as I was walking out, he said, hey, brother, would you want to go to Hawaii this year? Because I have these 2 round trip tickets, and I was going to go with the person I was previously in a relationship with. And I said, I'd love to, but I just can't. This is what is planned, and then I really have to get back to Atlanta and reroute. And so it's just in the back of my mind now. It's been a few months since then, a couple months. But, I said, I'm just going to send him a note and just see. So I say, hey, brother, how's it going? Did you ever get someone to travel with you to Hawaii? He said, no, I asked several friends and none of them could go. So I'm just going to let the tickets lapse. I said, oh, that's unfortunate. I said, well, when were you able to go? And he said, because, I'm thinking I don't want to manipulate my brother to get a ticket to Hawaii. So I'm trying to figure out what his scenario is. And he says, well, the only time I could go all year, because he's in radio and he can't just take off random time, is actually the week of Thanksgiving. And So the week of Thanksgiving abuts to the day that the retreat started. It started like the Sunday or the Monday of that following week. I said, oh, okay, interesting. Gotcha. And if you did go to Hawaii, like what island would you want to go to? Because again, I don't want to manipulate my brother to my advantage. He said, I've been 3 times. So if you could go and you wanted to go, you could pick any island you want. So within 24 hours, I've gotten this email, saying you're one of a few people that we've selected randomly to come. And completely unexpectedly, money that was written off that had not been thought of in many months just appears the next morning in our account. And then my brother's basically like, hey, have a free round trip ticket to exactly where you need to go. I said, I guess I'm going to meet Ram Dass. And I always knew in my heart as soon as I got that email that I would, but I still played the game of, So I go. I flew out there, spent time with my brother. We had Thanksgiving together, traveled to islands. I had never been to Hawaii. And so then I go and they pair you up with roommates if you haven't been before. And I don't know a single soul. I don't know anyone at that point in Atlanta who really knows Ram Dass or anything. So I go and they put me with a couple of roommates, and I meet this really nice guy from New York who had been once a few years ago and had met Ram Dass for the first time. And, we're just talking and chit-chatting. Of course, everyone you meet, if you don't already know them, the question is, well, how do you know Ram Dass, or how do you know of his work? So that's all your conversations every day. And it was beautiful because you meet one person and you'd be like, oh, like, how are you connected to Ram Dass? And be like, oh, I was the third person to meet Neem Karoli Baba in 1960 something, You're like, okay. Or, they might be like me, who, like, I didn't really know who the guy was 6 months ago, but I've been listening to his podcast. It was the whole spectrum. Stephen, who was this guy who had been a couple years before that, he said, when I was here for the first time, they were really just prepping and getting ready in the main meeting gathering area. And when I walked in and it was just Ram Dass by himself with a few people because we had gotten there early, kind of before the retreat started. And he said, would you want to go walk in there with me and just see if he's there again this year? And I was like, in my head, you have to understand, if you don't really know his work, or you don't really understand how it really can affect your whole outlook and your soul. I never had a relationship, like an adoration of like a human teacher in that way at that point. And so it was like meeting your hero at that point. All the stories, all the beings he had met, all the things he had written and created. So it was kind of, I was like, okay, so we might walk in this room and then he'll just be there hanging out. It was hard for me to kind of reconcile that. So I was like, sure, let's go. And we walk in, and sure enough, there's like 5 people in the room, and there he is in his wheelchair in the corner. And, Stephen walked right up and started interacting and talking with him. And I'm just kind of, you play out that thing of you're going to meet someone, like, oh, what are you going to say? What are you going to do? And so I'm standing back a little bit because I don't know how it's appropriate to interact with him, just being respectful. And he can kind of see and sense that I'm standing back some. And so he like motions over, like, come here. And then it's like, I'm standing there and I don't really know what to say because I kind of go blank, and all I can get out is thank you so much for everything you've done. It's like, I'm like, that's what you said, and yeah, so just like Dalai Lama, because I've been with the Dalai Lama just maybe a month and a half before that. What I felt instantly was beyond the words, beyond the body, there was this energy field, and I felt it deeply somatically. I felt it in my heart, not an idea, something very palpable, something very real. And that's that field of unconditional love, that is quote unquote contagious, if you will. You can feel it. And once you feel these openings being around these beings, then you know what's possible in terms of how your field can be open and how your field can sense things and perceive things. And um, yeah, so that was my first interaction, and then it was a beautiful, beautiful. I guess it was maybe like four days, something like that. So Krishna Das, who's a very famous kirtan musician, would play at night, and Ram Dass and other people would do talks during the day. And Ram Dass at that point, he had had a stroke 30 years before. So whenever he would speak, he knew exactly in his head. He was completely cogent. But it would take him a long time to get words out after a stroke. So it created this atmosphere of just like complete sacred reverence where people would hang on every word, and he would say like, the essence of the universe. And it would just go silent for like maybe 10 or 15 seconds. Everyone's like, what is that? And it was like, oh, it's just like, you were just in this really respectful wisdom sharing that actually his pauses really created this interesting environment to receive and to learn and to really savor, not taking any word for granted, not taking any syllable for granted. So yeah, and there were just lots of beautiful, beautiful moments throughout that time. But his caretakers would kind of wheel him around the room, different places. I remember one day after lunch, I think, it might have been the last day, and I was loving every second, but I'd had a big lunch. I was kind of dozing off, and I just sitting there, not falling asleep fully, but just kind of my head down, dozing, and I just kind of open my eyes. I'm looking, and I just see this foot. And in that time, they had wheeled him over next to me, and I just look, and I'm like, oh my God. And I was looking at that foot, and I was thinking all the places that foot had been and all the things that it had done. There's just all these really beautiful moments. And the very end of the week, of the time together, they do this mala ceremony. So every person goes in front of him, and he would just channel this loving awareness, this unconditional love. By people would come one by one in front of him, and he would just like look directly into your soul. And he's not saying anything generally. He's just, it's hard to explain, to just say that he would just be there smiling. It wasn't that. It was that times a million burning suns. And apparently his staff members would tell him every year, like, please don't do the mala ceremony because it's so intensive on your body, because he would have to do this for like 4 hours. People would come by one, and he'd be sweating. They bring cold cloths and ice like to put on him. And he would refuse. He'd say, yes, I have to do this. This is what I do, And so you go and you just receive this unconditional love. And then he kind of goes like, and there's a big picture of Neem Karoli Baba, who left his body in the early 1970s. And so there's a picture, and he's like, meet Neem Karoli Baba. And then you go, and they give you a mala, so a bracelet, a mala bracelet, and the bracelet has one string from Maharaji. Neem Karoli Baba was also called Maharaji. His blanket, one of the blankets he wore, he only wore blankets. So I had no idea that was going to happen. And yeah, incredible experiences. Lots of tears, lots of love, lots of heart opening. And I knew without any doubt, I'm like, this is my home. This is my spiritual home. And once you find that, it doesn't mean you're closed to other things. It means you can even be more open because you know exactly where you're sitting. And it gives you an anchor to be even more courageous, more fearless, more open-hearted, less doubts, because your roots just go deeper and deeper. And their roots. So it's not a prison. So its roots are deepening into the life of the earth and everything that you need to sustain yourself. And you're giving off loving energy to everyone, and you're receiving everything as it comes to you. That's freedom and finding your spiritual home. It's not, I only know this one thing and I believe this one thing because, someone told me, or I'm going to be a good person. That's not it for spirituality. So when I find my spiritual home, it's a deep rootedness that enhances my fearlessness, that deepens my courage, and allows me to be more fully human and more fully able to explore my own spiritual essence. So, ever since then, it started a real direct relationship with a being and a force and an energy that has not been in a human body since 1973, which is Neem Karoli Baba. And if you had told me before that time that I would have any kind of relationship with a being, when I say relationship, I'm not talking about praying in a passive way to a picture or an idea in my head that I'll be good if I do these things to someone who I don't really know directly. I'm talking about a direct relationship like you would have with your parents or your grandparents. And actually, I'm talking about a relationship that's closer than that, which is hard to conceive of if you haven't experienced something like this. And that is the truth. So it was from that point forward, after spending time with Ram Dass and more deeply through him knowing Neem Karoli Baba, that my own direct relationship with Neem Karoli Baba deepened immensely. And even though he was already in my field and in my practice, there was something very important beyond me to call me there to be with Ram Dass that opened me up in ways that I don't know that I could have experienced otherwise. Maybe. So after that, then I did finally return to Atlanta and did start to reroute. But that leads us into the next part of this whole saga, which is just Love Forest. So this is the flow of the story is what happened, kind of journeying around, trying to experience everything, looking for my spiritual home, meeting Ram Dass, knowing Neem Karoli Baba, like my deepest companion in this journey. And then once I had that rootedness and that fearlessness and that courage with all my practice that I developed over, that period of time, that's what led me into the chapter of then going outward. Things started coming out of me as a channel. And that leads us into my dharmic path, which is always unfolding, but has unfolded as the creation of and support of and love of Just Love Forest. So we'll stop there today. I do offer up, if you are curious about Ram Dass, to maybe look at the Here and Now podcast and just see if you can get up to, I believe it's episode 5 when he meets Neem Karoli Baba, and see if the story resonates. And if so, then it'll take you on a whole nother journey. And if not, then drop it because it's not for you. So yeah, let's stop there today. And I love you all very much. Thank you for taking time to listen to these stories. And hopefully there's something in here for you to receive or be inspired by or open up to. So wishing you all the best. Lots of love.